Under the choking stench of death and the distant sound of gunfire, the gates of Bergen-Belsen swung open. It wasn't freedom that entered. It was revelation. British and Canadian troops, hardened by years of combat, stepped into the camp in April 1945 expecting a prison. What they found was an apocalypse in slow motion. Tens of thousands of emaciated figures stumbled through a hellscape of corpses, filth, and collapsed humanity. Disease had done what bullets and gas had not. Typhus, dysentery, and starvation carved their initials into every body left standing, and as the liberators moved deeper, their boots crushed what was left of civilization. This wasn't Auschwitz with its industrial precision. Bergen-Belsen was rot. It was entropy, a slow death orchestrated by neglect, sustained by cruelty, and managed by people who once wore the uniform of order. Among them were women, not in the shadows, not as accessories, but as guards, disciplinarians, and executioners in everything but name. Irma Grace, Johanna Bormann, Elisabeth Volkenrath, Irene Haschke, Herta Ellert, names that would soon bleed from court documents into nightmares. They were young, some barely in their 20s, many volunteered, others transferred in, but none arrived unaware of what they were stepping into. By 1945, Bergen-Belsen was no mystery. It was a burial pit, masquerading as a labor camp. Its stench reached kilometers away. Its victims needed no translation. Yet these women enforced its rhythms. They cracked whips, loosed dogs, decided who ate and who died. They ordered roll calls that lasted hours in the freezing mud. They beat prisoners for looking the wrong way. They turned punishment into ritual, sadism into routine. Irma Grace, the so-called hyena of Auschwitz, became the most infamous. With her blonde hair, polished boots, and pistol on her hip, she patrolled the grounds with theatrical cruelty. Survivors testified to her hand-picking victims for transport to the gas chambers. Others remembered her setting her German shepherds on prisoners for sport. Johanna Bormann carried a whip. Her trained dog was not a pet. It was a weapon. She would unleash it at a glance, letting it tear through flesh as she stood watching with indifference, or worse, amusement. Elisabeth Volkenrath ran the women's camp with administrative efficiency and moral vacancy, signing off on punishments and selections with the detachment of a civil servant. When the British took the camp, these women didn't vanish. They didn't hide. They were captured alongside dozens of male guards. Some tried to minimize their roles. Others denied everything. A few, like Herta Ehlert, confessed, not out of remorse, but out of exasperation. It was like this in all the camps, she told investigators. We were told to do it, and we did. But what followed was no ordinary justice. The British convened one of the first war crimes trials in history, the Belsen trial. It took place in Lüneburg, not far from the camp itself. The air still smelled of death. The survivors still carried the scars. There were 45 defendants. 11 were women. This was more than a courtroom. It was a mirror to the world's failure. And it was filmed. For the first time, war crimes were being documented not just for records, but for history. The footage captured Irma Grace standing in the dock, unrepentant. Bormann and Volkenrath, stony-faced. The British presented mounds of evidence, survivor testimonies, medical reports, camp records, and most devastatingly, the visual proof, film reels showing the mountains of corpses and the living skeletons that stumbled past them. There was no question of guilt, only the measure of it. The trial lasted nearly 2 months. Defense arguments ranged from "we followed orders" to "we were powerless." The women's youth, appearance, and gender were brought up by both defense and press, but the facts stood naked in the dock. These were not women misled. They were enforcers, architects of suffering. When the verdicts were handed down in November 1945, the silence in the courtroom could have choked a man. Irma Grace, death. Johanna Bormann, death. Elizabeth Volkenrath, death. 8 others were sentenced to death alongside them, including Camp Commandant Josef Kramer, the so-called Beast of Belsen. Justice had spoken. Now justice would hang them, and it would fall to one man to deliver it. Albert Pierrepoint, Britain-Sepp's chief executioner, a man of meticulous ritual and quiet efficiency. Pierrepoint was not a butcher. He saw himself as a servant of the law. His job was not to inflict pain. It was to end life cleanly, without drama, without spectacle. He had hanged traitors, spies, murderers, but nothing had prepared him for Belsen. The condemned were transferred to Hamelin prison. They were kept under tight surveillance. Suicide, especially after Goering's stunt in Nuremberg, would not be tolerated. Pierrepoint arrived in December. He had executed hundreds, but this was different. The names on the list were infamous. The crimes, unimaginable. The pressure, enormous. The executions would be done in pairs, rapidly, without delay. December 13, 1945. Pierrepoint readied the gallows. The process was methodical. Each prisoner was weighed. Measurements were taken to calculate the correct drop. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about physics. A short drop could strangle. A long drop could decapitate. Pierrepoint's calculations were designed to ensure neither. The condemned were led from their cells in silence. Irma Grace was first. She refused a blindfold. She wore her prison uniform, gray skirt, white blouse. She walked with her head high, lips pressed into a smirk. "Are you ready?" Pierrepoint asked. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. The trap door opened. History ended one life. Then Bormann, then Volkenrath, then Kramer. One by one they dropped through the floorboards into darkness. The process lasted less than 90 minutes. By the end, 11 were dead. Pierrepoint never spoke much of that day, but he recorded every detail in his notes. Grace's calm demeanor, Bormann's trembling, Kramer's silence. He treated them as he treated all his subjects, with formality, not emotion. But the world was watching. Newspapers printed the names. Rumors spread. Some claimed Grace screamed. Others said she cursed her executioner. All false. The executions were too fast, too controlled. Pierrepoint left no room for drama. And yet drama followed. These hangings were not hidden. They were reported, discussed, debated. Unlike the Nuremberg bodies, these did not vanish into silence. The world saw the aftermath, the images of the accused, the calm efficiency of their removal. And in that visibility something shifted. For the first time, the myth of female innocence and atrocity was shattered. Grace became a symbol, not just of Nazi cruelty, but of how ideology infects every level of society, every gender, every age. She was 22 when she died, but she had overseen the deaths of thousands. The question was no longer, how could a woman do this? It was how many more did, because Grace wasn't sit alone. She was a product of a system, a regime that demanded cruelty and rewarded it, a machine where obedience was virtue and brutality was currency. And Bergen-Belsen was that machine, stripped bare. A place where starvation was policy, where dogs were weapons, where soup became a tool of control, where the line between punishment and extermination dissolved. The executions at Hamelin were not the end of justice, but a statement, a declaration that no role, no rank, no gender would shield the guilty. That suffering demanded consequence. That memory would be anchored in accountability. But as the trapdoors swung and the rope snapped taut, one question hung heavier than any corpse. Could it ever be enough? 11 executions, dozens of convictions, hundreds of witness statements, thousands of corpses left behind as evidence. Yet for every name sentenced in Lüneburg, hundreds more slipped through the net, guards who vanished into post-war chaos, doctors who reinvented themselves in civilian hospitals, secretaries, typists, camp administrators who went back to families, to dinner tables, to lives uninterrupted. Bergen-Belsen was not a mystery after the war. It was a monument of rotting proof. The British filmed it, photographed it, opened it to journalists. They didn't need to embellish. The truth was loud enough. And yet the scale of accountability never matched the scale of the crime. Why? Because justice, after atrocity, is never clean. It is triage. It is compromise. It is balancing the desire to punish with the need to rebuild. And the Allies needed Germany functional, fast. Which meant many who should have stood in the dock were instead handed pensions. Some even promotions. But what makes Bergen-Belsen unique, horrific as it was the sheer visibility of its collapse. It was a camp that wasn't designed to kill on an industrial scale like Auschwitz, but in the final months it rivaled any killing center in death toll, because it died alongside the Reich. As the Eastern Front collapsed, the Nazis flooded Belsen with evacuees from other camps. Trains arrived packed with bodies and barely breathing ghosts. The SS abandoned organization. Infrastructure collapsed. Food stopped arriving. Medicine was non-existent. And yet the beatings continued. The dogs were fed, even as prisoners starved. The female guards showed no sign of changing their routines. Witnesses recall guards still patrolling with their crops and pistols. Even as typhus raged, orders were shouted. People were shot. There was no pretense of rescue, only inertia, only death. By the time the British entered, some SS men had already fled. Others stayed, waiting to surrender. Kramer, the commandant, stood among the dying with bureaucratic detachment, his hands folded behind his back, his posture perfect. When accused, his defense was chilling. We were simply overwhelmed. There was nothing more we could do. But this wasn't nest incompetence. This was abandonment as policy. And within that policy, the role of the female guards becomes even more terrifying. Because their cruelty persisted even when the system around them crumbled. It was not fear of superiors. It was not panic. It was initiative. They beat prisoners because they chose to. They withheld food because they could. And even in the chaos of April 1945, they wore their roles like armor. This is the core of what the Belsen trial revealed. That evil doesn't always roar from the top. It trickles down. It grows in uniforms and routines and petty bureaucracies. It thrives when people are told they have power over others and no consequences for how they use it. Take Irene Haschke. She wasn't a commandant. She wasn't famous. But she worked in the kitchen. And in a world where food meant life, that made her God. Prisoners testified that she regularly beat those who begged for scraps. She withheld rations as punishment. Sometimes she gave food, only to snatch it back and laugh. Not a gas chamber, not a bullet, but cruelty just as sharp. This is the overlooked architecture of genocide. The system doesn't work without its minor players. Without the people who carry clipboards, guard gates, and ladle soup. They are the scaffolding of horror. And at Belsen they stood exposed. But exposure did not always lead to justice. Many were arrested, fewer were tried, even fewer were convicted. Some were sentenced only to a few years. Some were released early. Some reinvented themselves with new names in a fractured Germany, more interested in economic survival than moral reckoning. For a brief moment, the world had the moral high ground, but it slipped quickly. By the 1950s, Cold War priorities eclipsed war crimes. Documents were buried, files sealed. Former Nazis were suddenly useful, especially if they had intelligence value. And in that shadow, the memory of Bergen-Belsen began to fade. The trials were recorded, but the footage was shelved. Survivor testimonies were archived, but not widely taught. The images of piled corpses circulated in books, but the stories behind the faces were lost. Justice became a headline, not a process, and the horror became history, not warning. But for survivors, it never became past. Many who lived through Belsen carried the camp inside them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke, most did not. They remembered the women with whips, the laughter behind the beatings, the dogs that lunged at flesh for sport, the endless roll calls in the freezing wind, the taste of soup that wasn't set given, the faces that disappeared, one by one without farewell. And for those survivors, the trials were not closure. They were punctuation, a pause, a breath, but never an end. Because Bergen-Belsen was not a place that could be left behind. It lived on in scars, in silence, in the stories children never heard, and in the nightmares that never stopped coming. Even today, the name carries weight. But how many know what it truly means? How many know that the guards who stood at its gates were not just men in black coats, but women in gray skirts with boots polished and eyes hard? How many know that justice came not with a bullet but with a rope, and even then only for a few? How many know that after the hangings, after the headlines, the world turned its gaze elsewhere? That Belsen became a cautionary tale too inconvenient to teach in full. Because to teach it in full is to acknowledge a truth that civilization resists. That cruelty is not rare, that sadism is not foreign, that the capacity to inflict suffering lies dormant in more people than we dare admit, and that systems of atrocity are built not just by monsters, but by neighbors, colleagues, clerks, women who clock in, men who sign forms, supervisors who look the other way. The story of Bergen-Belsen is not just about the bodies or the gallows. It's about the thin line that separates order from collapse, the brittle wall between society and savagery, and the horrifying ease with which that wall crumbles when authority says, "These people are not people." When law becomes weapon, when uniform becomes license, when silence becomes complicity, and when the ones holding the keys and the batons and the bowls of soup believe they will never be held to account. But some were, for a moment, and that moment mattered. It mattered because it forced the world to reckon with a question that haunts every post-conflict society. What does justice actually look like when the crime is unthinkable? At Bergen-Belsen, the bodies were stacked like firewood. Death was ambient. Murder wasn't hidden behind locked gas chambers or shrouded in bureaucratic euphemisms. It was naked, rotting, and defiant. The images didn't require interpretation. They were their own indictment. Yet the legal system still had to make distinctions. Who gave orders? Who followed them? Who acted with malice? Who simply did their job? And what about those who stood in the margins of authority? This is where the Bergen-Belsen trials broke new ground and also exposed new limits. They tried not just high-ranking commandants, but low-level guards, medical staff, and women. That was revolutionary. For the first time, the machinery of genocide was seen not as a faceless apparatus, but as a constellation of individuals, each contributing a thread to the web of atrocity. One such thread was Herta Ehlert, not as infamous as Grace's, but more revealing in her testimony. She admitted to beatings. She described routine violence. She justified it as discipline. Her defense wasn't innocence. It was normalization. This is how the camps operated, she told the court. This is what was expected. And that, in a way, was more terrifying than denial, because it proved that horror doesn't always require fanaticism. Sometimes it only requires conformity, compliance, the slow erosion of moral resistance. Taylor didn't see herself as a monster. She saw herself as a professional. That was her truth. And the courtroom, for all its power, struggled to address it, because the law punishes crimes. But what about culture? What about the systemic rot that trains people to look at emaciated children and see a threat? These were the questions that hovered over every testimony, every photograph, every scar. Then there was Dr. Fritz Klein, the camp doctor, a man who took the Hippocratic Oath and then stood over pits filled with corpses. When asked how he reconciled his role as a healer with his presence at Bergen-Belsen, he replied, "My duty is to my people, not to individuals." It was the logic of eugenics wrapped in a white coat, a philosophy that turned science into selection, medicine into murder. Klein was hanged, but his ideology didn't die with him. Elements of it resurfaced, quietly, in post-war scientific institutions, in medical debates about ethics, in the slow unspooling of what it means when knowledge serves power instead of humanity. This is another uncomfortable truth Bergen-Belsen forces us to confront. Atrocity is rarely the work of uneducated brutes. It is often facilitated by people with degrees, titles, credentials, people who can navigate a courtroom as easily as a command post, which is why the trials had to go beyond punishment. They had to become documentation, a record, a warning. And yet, even in that effort, the cracks showed, because many of those convicted at Lüneburg didn't serve their full sentences. Some were released early. Some returned to ordinary lives. Some simply disappeared. Germany and the world moved on. The Cold War needed stable allies, not prolonged reckonings, and so files were closed. Names were redacted. Justice became selective, then symbolic. But survivors didn't sit forget, nor did the British soldiers who liberated the camp. Many of them left Bergen-Belsen permanently altered. Some never spoke of it again. Others turned to advocacy, haunted by the smell, the silence, the sheer scale of what they had witnessed. And what they had witnessed was not just death. It was the aftermath of a system that had collapsed not from external pressure, but from internal moral decay. Because Bergen-Belsen didn't function because of SS commandants alone. It functioned because of people like Elizabeth Volkenrath, who handled administration like a civil service job. Because of nurses who measured out medicine selectively, withholding it from the sickest prisoners. Because of kapos, prisoner functionaries who, under the boot of the SS, inflicted violence to survive. The camp's cruelty wasn't just vertical, it was lateral, woven into every interaction, every hierarchy, every meal. And it persisted until the very last day. In fact, the period between January and April 1945 was one of the most lethal in the camp's existence. As the Nazi Empire collapsed, its camps turned feral, rules broke down, food vanished, disease exploded. But the violence didn't stop. The whips kept cracking, the dogs kept biting, the orders kept coming. This was the final bitter truth Bergen-Belsen revealed, that systems of cruelty do not require strength. They can persist through inertia, through habit, through the simple fact that people will keep doing what they've always done, even when there's no longer a reason to do it. And when that system finally ended, it ended not with dignity, but with chaos. Liberation was not a clean handoff from oppressor to rescuer. It was a disaster zone. Thousands of prisoners too weak to move, corpses everywhere, typhus rampant. The British tried to respond, but they were soldiers, not doctors. They bulldozed corpses into mass graves. They quarantined the sick. They rationed food, sometimes in ways that killed rather than helped. Mistakes were made, and survivors, even as they celebrated liberation, died in droves. This is another layer of tragedy, rarely told, that the moment of salvation was also, for many, the moment their bodies finally gave out, that for some, the freedom they had waited for arrived an hour too late. And within that chaos, a different kind of reckoning unfolded. Prisoners turned on collaborators. Capos were beaten to death. SS guards who hadn't fled were lynched on the spot. It wasn't justice, it was rage. Undisciplined, raw, primal. And it spoke to something the trials could never contain, the moral imbalance left by genocide. Because courts can issue sentences, juries can declare guilt, but they cannot restore what was taken. They cannot return mothers, fathers, children. They cannot erase the taste of starvation or the echo of a gunshot in the middle of the night. And so for some, justice meant rope, not testimony. For others, justice never came at all. They fled to Argentina, Syria, Egypt, or they melted into German society, protected by silence and a collective desire to forget, which is why the legacy of Bergen-Belsen doesn't live in court transcripts. It lives in the survivors' hissed voices, in the faces captured by British film crews, in the mass graves that dot Lower Saxony. It lives in the moral architecture built in response, the Geneva Conventions, the UN Genocide Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of them shaped in part by what the world saw when it entered Bergen-Belsen. And yet even these instruments, noble as they are, remain fragile. They depend on memory, on vigilance, on the willingness of each generation to confront the worst of what we're capable of, because Bergen-Belsen wasn't a relic of ancient cruelty. It was modern. It used trains, documents, efficiency. Its perpetrators wore uniforms, not tribal paint. They spoke German, not the language of barbarism. They were not monsters. They were people, ordinary, methodical, lethal. And the only thing that made their system fall was defeat, not regret. That truth sits at the heart of Bergen-Belsen, a camp that wasn't built to kill but did, a place that became the final resting point for over 50,000 souls, and the starting point for one of history's most important and most unsettling trials. But for every sentence carried out, another remained unspoken. For every sentence handed down by the British military tribunal at Lüneburg, there were 10 unspoken indictments left to rot in the silence of post-war amnesia, because even as the courtrooms echoed with the names of Irma Grayson, Joseph Kramer, others simply vanished into towns, into jobs, into new lives scrubbed clean by the collective desire to move forward. Justice, as it turned out, had a shelf life. And once the cameras were packed away and the transcripts filed, West Germany found itself needing stability more than retribution. The Cold War was escalating. The threat was no longer fascism, it was communism. And suddenly yesterday's criminals became today's bureaucrats, lawyers, engineers. Former SS members were quietly reintegrated. Some resumed careers in medicine, education, even politics. Denazification, once a moral imperative, became a bureaucratic inconvenience. And Bergen-Belsen? It was now history. A cautionary tale, yes, but one that many preferred to keep at arm's length. Yet the bodies still lay there, The mass graves hastily dug with bulldozers became silent monuments to unfinished reckoning. British troops had marked them with simple signs. Here lie 5,000 dead, here lie 2,000 more, but there was no monument big enough to account for what had happened. No inscription that could contain the truth. And truth was elusive, because in the aftermath, so much remained unclear. How many died in total? What were their names? How many guards escaped? What exactly did each prisoner endure? The records were patchy, the testimonies conflicting, the trauma, in many cases, too deep to voice. This is the paradox of atrocity. It produces too much suffering to ever be fully catalogued, and yet it demands cataloging because the alternative is erasure. That's why the Bergen-Belsen trials mattered, not because they were perfect, but because they were recorded. The testimonies were taken, the faces filmed, the names preserved, and in those names, a blueprint emerged, not just for how genocide operates, but how it is allowed to operate, and perhaps most disturbingly, how it is remembered. Or not. Because for decades, Bergen-Belsen was overshadowed by other camps. Auschwitz, with its gas chambers and global infamy, became the symbolic heart of the Holocaust. Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, extermination factories, were studied for their industrial horror. But Bergen-Belsen? It was quieter, less systematic. It didn't have the architecture of death. It had starvation, disease, neglect. It had rot. And that somehow made it harder to frame, harder to fit into the narrative of Nazi precision. Because Bergen-Belsen wasn't about efficiency, it was about collapse. It showed what happens when ideology meets entropy. When the state no longer cares who lives or dies because the goal is no longer control, it's abandonment. And in that abandonment, the guards thrived. The system may have been falling apart, but the violence did not. If anything, it intensified. That's what survivors testified to: not chaos, but cruelty amid chaos. Beatings continued. Selections were still made. Food was still withheld, even when it was available. This wasn't disintegration. It was brutality given freedom. And women were central to it. This is the piece many modern viewers struggle with, the gender of the perpetrators. We are taught to see women as nurturers, victims, caregivers. But at Bergen-Belsen, they were wardens. Not passive participants, but active agents of suffering. Irma Grace became infamous, but she wasn't an anomaly. She was part of a network of female guards trained at Ravensbrück and assigned across the camp system. Many of them shared similar trajectories: young, working class, often seeking status or opportunity. The SS offered them power, uniforms, and they took it. Some with hesitation, others with zeal. And when the system collapsed, few showed remorse. In court, many denied knowledge of what was happening, even as photographs showed them standing amid the corpses. Others, like Herta Ehlert, admitted what they had done but insisted it was normal. It was the same in all the camps, she said. We had our orders. But what does that mean when the order is to withhold food? To stand by while typhus burns through human beings like fire through dry timber? To unleash dogs on people too weak to stand? The courts tried to draw lines. They gave death sentences to some, prison time to others. But Bergen-Belsen didn't run on a few sadists. It ran on 1,000 choices made by 1,000 hands. The person who locked the barrack door, the one who kept the medicine cabinet shut, the cook who poured soup for some and turned others away. This is the microphysics of mass atrocity, not ideology shouted from a podium, but practiced at eye level. And it's what makes Bergen-Belsen so difficult to process, because it wasn't efficient. It wasn't surgical. It was slow, messy, and intimate. People didn't vanish into gas chambers. They died where they slept, where they stood. They died in piles, and the guards walked among them not with revulsion, but routine. This is what breaks the mind. That death became background noise, that a girl in her 20s could eat lunch a few meters from a trench filled with corpses and not blink, that survivors would describe guards joking, singing, going about their duties as if the camp weren't collapsing into a graveyard. It is this psychological decay, this normalization of inhumanity that defines Bergen-Belsen. And it didn't die with the executions, because the system that created it was never fully dismantled. It was papered over, rebranded, recycled into the structures of a new Germany, eager to rejoin the civilized world. Which is why even today Bergen-Belsen remains a contested memory. The memorial site exists. It is dignified, stark, honest, but it had to be fought for. Survivors had to demand it. Activists had to defend it against revisionists. For years the site was neglected, overgrown, underfunded, forgotten. Not by everyone, but by enough. Because remembering is hard. Not just emotionally, but politically. To remember Bergen-Belsen is to remember that women participated in genocide, that doctors facilitated mass death, that the mechanisms of civilization, law, order, routine, were co-opted by a regime that fed on dehumanization. It is to remember that evil doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it comes as a shrug, as an order followed, as a meal denied, as a body ignored. And that remembering, truly remembering, is not just about saying never again. It's about understanding how it happened in the first place, and how easily it could happen again. Because never again has always been a fragile promise, spoken in solemn ceremonies, inscribed on stone and too often betrayed in practice. Bergen-Belsen is not just a horror story confined to 1945. It's a case study in how societies unravel, how institutions mutate, and how the mask of civilization can disintegrate into chaos when dehumanization becomes policy. And it begins with language. The inmates of Belsen weren't prisoners in the eyes of the SS. They were subhumans, vermin, useless eaters, stripped of names, numbers tattooed on arms, identities erased by starvation and lice. The camp was designed to destroy not just the body, but the very concept of personhood. When people are no longer people, anything becomes possible. That's what made Bergen-Belsen different. It didn't need gas chambers to achieve annihilation. It used time. It used deprivation. And it used deprivation. And it used words, reductionist labels that sanctioned violence at every level. Even the layout of the camp mirrored this logic. Segregated barracks, separate compounds for Jews, political prisoners, Roma, and undesirables, an internal geography of worth, hierarchies that determined who received food, medicine, or protection. The closer one was to the Nazi racial ideal, the slower the death. These microstructures enabled macro atrocities. They turned every guard into a judge, every work assignment into a death sentence, every roll call into a ritual of humiliation. And the trauma didn't at liberation. Survivors left Bergen-Belsen, but Bergen-Belsen never left them. They carried its bacteria, its fever, its memories. Some were sent to displaced persons camps that weren't much better, still behind fences, still under guard, still dependent on outside authorities for food and shelter. For some, it was years before they found real freedom, and even then it came with silence. Because who could understand what they had seen? Who could believe that 13-year-olds watched infants die in front of them? That women gave birth in piles of corpses? that the sky above Belsen stayed gray even on sunny days. That memory itself could become a prison. For many survivors, speaking was impossible, not because they lacked the words, but because the world lacked the will to listen. The British filmed the camp. They documented the liberation. They showed it in newsreels. But the images became too much, too soon. Censors stepped in. The footage disappeared from public circulation for decades. It was deemed too shocking, too graphic. A quiet consensus emerged. Some things were best not seen, not too much, not too clearly. And so the reality of Bergen-Belsen faded from textbooks and headlines, replaced by abstractions. Terms like war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, legal categories that sanitized the horror, made it manageable. But there seeps nothing abstract about starvation, about mothers watching their children die and then having to carry the body to a mass grave with their own hands, about the reek of gangrene and rot in the same building where guards played cards and smoked cigarettes. This is the truth that doesn't fit neatly into post-war narratives of justice and redemption, because Bergen-Belsen is the inconvenient reminder that even when the war ends, the horror lingers, that the moment of liberation is not a clean break, but a slow reckoning, and it raises uncomfortable questions. What happens to the survivors who can rebuild? What happens to the perpetrators who never face trial? What does society owe to the memory of the dead and to the trauma of the living? There were attempts to answer these questions. Memorials were erected, streets renamed, school curricula revised. But these gestures, while important, often struggled to keep pace with the resurgence of denial and distortion. Neo-Nazi groups dismissed Bergen-Belsen as propaganda. Holocaust revisionists cherry-picked the chaos of liberation to claim the deaths were caused by Allied neglect, not Nazi policy. And in the absence of continuous education, these lies found echo chambers, online forums, social media platforms, echoes in dark corners of political discourse. That's why the trials, flawed as they were, still matter, because they captured truth in a legal record, because they turned testimony into evidence, because they offered names. Names like Greta Bozell, who selected sick inmates for death, like Fritz Klein, who claimed his oath to racial purity overrode his duty as a physician, like Elizabeth Volkenrath, who rose through the ranks not by competence but cruelty. These weren't set abstractions. They were real people. And their crimes were banal in their execution, but catastrophic in effect, which is the central lesson of Bergen-Belsen. That evil doesn't need grand designs. It only needs permission, a shrug from a superior, an order written in pencil, a policy that turns away from suffering and says, "Not our problem." Because indifference is the soil in which atrocity grows, and Belsen was a garden of it. From the administration that ignored the typhus outbreak, to the logistics officers who continued shuttling prisoners into a space designed for 8,000, already holding over 60,000 by April 1945. Every step was a choice, every delay a death, and the guards, men and women alike, played their part with horrifying consistency. But it wasn't just the Germans. There were collaborators from multiple countries. Ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe, prisoner functionaries who rose through internal hierarchies by enforcing SS rules, French, Polish, Hungarian, and Czech nationals who, for reasons ranging from ideology to survival, participated in the apparatus of cruelty. This is another layer rarely discussed, because it shatters the illusion of national innocence, of a neat division between victims and perpetrators, of the idea that one ideology, one nation, one party could bear all the blame. In reality, the Holocaust, and Bergen-Belsen in particular, was a multinational crime, enabled by silence and fear and opportunism across borders. Which is why remembrance must also be transnational. It cannot belong solely to Germany or to the Jewish people or to Europe. It belongs to humanity. And it comes with responsibility. To confront rising authoritarianism, to challenge dehumanizing rhetoric, to expose the early warning signs that precede systemic violence. Because Bergen-Belsen did not begin with mass graves. It began with laws, with propaganda, with a culture of obedience and punishment. And those elements are not relics. They are present in varying degrees across the globe today. That's why the story of Belsen's guards remains urgent, not just for what they did, but for how they got there. Many were young. Some were indoctrinated. Others were ambitious. All became complicit. And that complicity was normalized, institutionalized, even rewarded, until the day the system collapsed and the reckoning came. But even that reckoning was uneven. Some guards were hanged, others sentenced to years. A few walked free within months. The ones who died became infamous. The ones who lived often escaped scrutiny. Yet both groups carried Bergen-Belsen inside them. And so do we. Not because we lived it, but because we inherited its lessons. Because the burden of memory is collective. And it is not light. And that burden is not ceremonial. It is moral. It is not something we display once a year in wreath-laying rituals or documentary screenings. It is something we must carry daily into our politics, our education, our culture, because the lessons of Bergen-Belsen are not lessons unless they inform how we think about power, about obedience, about responsibility. What was power at Bergen-Belsen? It was the power to deny food, the power to issue orders, the power to hit a prisoner and never face consequences. But it was also the power of neglect, the power to look away, to let disease spread, to let bodies pile up until there were more corpses than living. And what was obedience? It was the daily ritual of accepting that someone else's suffering was part of the job. That rules mattered more than morality. That survival meant keeping your head down, even as the screams grew louder. Irma Gress didn't rise through the ranks because she was smarter or stronger. She rose because she was obedient and ruthless and willing to learn quickly what the system rewarded. She watched others, imitated them, improved on their methods, and in that evolution we see a terrifying truth. Cruelty can be taught, violence can be learned, and the institution that teaches it doesn't need to be overtly sadistic. It just needs to remove accountability. Bergen-Belsen removed accountability. The guards knew the war was ending. They saw Germany collapsing, but they kept going. They kept beating, starving, withholding, not because they believed in victory, but because they believed they were immune. And for some, they were. That's another wound history hasn't healed. That so many perpetrators were never tried, that some were never even identified, that records were lost or destroyed or sealed in archives, that even today we don't have a full list of the staff who ran the camp in its final months. What we do have are testimonies, and those testimonies paint a portrait that is both granular and vast. They describe the texture of suffering, the way the lice moved in the seams of clothing, the way hunger turned people into shadows, silent, skeletal, barely moving, the way you learned to walk around the dead as if they were part of the landscape. And they describe the texture of violence, the snap of a whip on bare skin, the way Gress smiled when her dog tore into someone, the way guards forced prisoners to drag corpses, then punished them for crying. This is what the court at Lüneburg confronted. But the law can only capture so much. It can name crimes, it can impose sentences, but it cannot resurrect the dead. It cannot repair a shattered childhood. It cannot return the time stolen from survivors who spent years in fear, silence, and stigma. Because yes, even after liberation, many were treated with suspicion. Displaced persons were often kept under surveillance. Jewish survivors were sometimes accused of exaggeration. Women who survived rape and sexual violence rarely spoke because there was no space for their stories, because trauma wasn't understood, because shame lingered. This too is part of Bergen-Belsen's legacy. The silences, the gaps in the record, the emotional blind spots in the post-war narrative, and yet somehow, survivors carried forward. They built families. They wrote memoirs. They testified, not all, but enough. Enough to ensure that Belsen wouldn't vanish into numbers, that it would remain a name, a place, a warning. But for that warning to endure, we must also confront its implications today. Because we live in a time where camps are still being used to detain refugees, to hold political prisoners, to isolate ethnic minorities, where authoritarian regimes still manipulate law to criminalize dissent, where hate speech is still normalized, where othering is still policy. Bergen-Belsen was not born from thin air. It was made possible by decades of anti-Semitism, militarism, and propaganda, by a society that tolerated incremental oppression until oppression became extermination. And if we believe ourselves immune to that trajectory, then we have already forgotten. That's why it matters that female guards were not exceptions. They were integral. They were trained, promoted, trusted with authority. And they show us that power, once given, reveals character. They show us that gender is not a shield from accountability, that women can be architects of horror just as easily as men. That ideology, when internalized, erases empathy. These guards didn't wake up one morning and become murderers. They adapted, they conformed, they learned the logic of the system, and they enforced it. Vulcanrath, Hashke, Bormann, Ehlert, names that should be studied alongside Himmler and Huss, not because they held equal rank, but because they completed the chain. Genocide does not occur only through command. It occurs through consent, through 1,000 small decisions made by ordinary people who believe they're doing their job. And that is the final danger. Bergen-Belsen exposes the ordinariness of evil. The fact that atrocity is not always loud or theatrical. Sometimes it is boring, bureaucratic, performed by people who clock in and clock out. This is the truth that unsettled even the liberators. British soldiers who expected resistance instead found submission. Guards who stood still. Commandants who handed over keys. The enemy didn't look monstrous. They looked tired. And that was the scariest part. Because it forced a realization that the machinery of mass death doesn't require madmen. It only requires routine. A routine of denial. A routine of cruelty. A routine of looking away. And in breaking that routine, in exposing it, trying it, punishing it, the Bergen-Belsen trials did more than deliver justice. They delivered clarity. For a moment, because soon after, the clarity blurred. The Cold War began. Justice was deprioritized. And the memory of Belsen, like so many others, slipped from the front pages. But it never disappeared completely. Not for the survivors. Not for the families of the victims. Not for the historians and educators who have kept the record alive. And not for the descendants of the perpetrators, some of whom have come forward generations later to ask questions their grandparents never answered. That, too, is part of the reckoning. The long shadow of Bergen-Belsen falls not only on the victims but on the world that allowed it to happen and the generations born in its aftermath. It is not a closed chapter. It is a mirror. And when we look into that mirror, we are forced to ask, What would I have done? What line would I have refused to cross? What silence would I have broken? And what silences am I accepting now? These questions have no easy answers, but they are necessary. Because Bergen-Belsen is not just history, it is a moral battlefield that still shapes the present. And so the story of Bergen-Belsen does not end with the clang of the gavel or the creak of the gallows. It does not end with the executions of Gress, Valkenrath, or Klein. It doesn't even end in the mass graves still carved into the German soil, because Bergen-Belsen was never just a place. It was a system, a failure, a wound. It remains with us in the questions it refuses to let us forget. How does a society decide whose life is unworthy? What does it take to look at a starving child and see an enemy? How many small steps, how many compromises, silences, excuses lead to a field full of corpses and a courtroom trying to make sense of it all? There is no closure for something like this, only responsibility. Responsibility to remember not as ritual but as warning. Responsibility to recognize when cruelty begins to wear the face of normalcy. Responsibility to teach not just what happened, but how it happened and why it was allowed to go on for so long. Because Bergen-Belsen did not fall from the sky. It was built, staffed, maintained, and when it began to collapse, it wasn't by some moral awakening, it was by military defeat. That sip's the hardest part to face, that the camp didn't end because its guards had a change of heart. It ended because it was taken. And when the British soldiers arrived, they didn't just liberate a place, they uncovered a mirror that still reflects the human capacity for both horror and endurance, for apathy and outrage. The survivors, those who crawled out of that pit of disease and despair, are the ones who carried the real justice forward, not through vengeance, but through memory, through testimony, through the simple, defiant act of telling the truth when the world was ready to forget. And now that memory is yours. What you do with it is the only ending that truly matters.